They told me nothing. Then they buried it. Then they called it an accident. What I found in a metal crate stamped with a mission patch and no manifest said otherwise. An unauthorized Apollo flight had gone beyond telemetry, beyond recorded course. It landed on the far side in August of 1967. The tapes, 5 magnetic reels, 3 microfilm strips, a pair of wire recordings, and a single mangled servo-driven data cartridge whispered a different story. I am the one who listened to them. My name is Benjamin Thorne. I restore sound for a living. I work in a windowless room that smells faintly of ozone and coffee, surrounded by stacks of brittle tape and machines that hum at low, steady frequencies. People bring me dead voices, and I pull them back into the light. I thought the project that arrived on a rainy Tuesday would be nothing more than a historical oddity. Redacted footage, mislabeled EVA chatter, perhaps a few damaged mission logs. Instead, I inherited a corridor of echoes that led back to something that had been waiting, patient and small, like a seed, under the quiet geometry of the moon. I will not pretend I kept my distance. Curiosity is the hazard of my trade. There is a method to what I do: cleaning noise, isolating channels, running spectral analysis until the phantom frequencies unclench and yield form. But these files resisted. They kept a bass note beneath everything, a subsonic hum that did not belong to any instrument I knew. It sat below hearing, below the line where normal human perception could claim authority. In the room, the hum translated into a pressure under the sternum. On the tapes, it showed as a steady carrier wave, a notch of energy that altered the very grain of sound. Day 1, 0112, intake transcript. The crate had no chain of custody stamp. A courier with a flat expression dropped it off at midnight, their badge obscured. The package smelled faintly of disinfectant and lunar dust. Inside, the reels were fingerprints that no record in any database matched. There was no cover letter, only one typed sheet. Project designation L67C. Classification restricted, archival retrieval. I cataloged, I labeled, I fed the first reel into an Ampex that trembled with age. The playback head spat out hiss and a voice, masculine, taut, clipped, speaking at a cadence trained by training and stress. It was a voice I later learned belonged to Commander Elias Vasquez. Transcripts are imperfect things. In the lab, they are scaffolding rather than evidence. I transcribe to triangulate what cannot be seen: the gaps between breaths, the time compression of panic, the way certain words slip into static and return altered. The first listening session I annotated with a careful hand. Vasquez reported visual contact with monolith-like forms, black towers on the far side. He described them in the tone a pilot uses to describe weather, not descriptive. Portent. Just facts. The voice trembled only once when he said, "It feels like the rock is breathing wrong." There it was, the motif. Wrong breathing. A phrase you keep in the bones. I cross-referenced crew manifests. The mission, lost in 1967 according to public record, had 3 crew members: Vasquez, Lieutenant Joseph Blake, and Specialist Daniel Hutchins. Behind those names, in the files that came with the reels, was a short memorandum from a man called Director Hawkins. Hawkins' signature sat neat and small at the bottom, like an apology one had trained oneself to write without regret. Another file introduced Dr. Leonard Patterson, who oversaw behavioral conditioning and neurological integration protocols. The 2 names would recur like refraction points in every subsequent document: the face of policy, the hand in the dark. The second reel, Day 3, 0204, contained EVA audio zipped with raw environmental feed. The far side recordings were thin, as if the moon itself had a throat too narrow for full sound. There were intermittent clicks and a low harmonic that shifted in phase with breathing. At 0218, Hutchins' voice cut in. He said, almost conversationally, "There's a structure. It's not like ours." A metallic clinking followed. Tools, or the sound of something forming. The black towers were not geological. They had edges that caught the sun wrong, surfaces like obsidian. Vasquez said, quietly, "It's crystalline. It takes your shadow." The technicians I consulted later, men and women who still talk in mission acronyms over beer, refused to speculate about alien architecture. That was not their job. But you cannot erase a photograph of a thing that rearranges the available vocabulary for rock. In the tapes, the towers did not look like monuments. They looked like teeth. I began to hear a pattern in the background noise. Besides the steady subsonic hum, there were micro-groans, shifts in the spectral noise that matched a pattern I would eventually see in my own EKG when I had to sleep. On reel 3, a voice I later identified as Blake started to lag. There was a latency between his inhalation and the recorded exhalation, a misalignment so small you might call it tape warble, except it persisted across mediums. The engineers labeled it breath pattern inconsistency and moved on. I did not. When I confronted Hawkins, because bravado is easier behind glass and under crisp lighting, he smiled like someone explaining a budget line. "Old missions," he said. "Classified anomalies happen. We quarantine them to avoid panic." Patterson's letters were more clinical. He wrote of sensory congruence experiments, of integration potential. Once, under his signature, someone had scribbled a sentence in red: "Containment preferred to disclosure." The suggestion beneath the ink was not explicit, but its meaning was. The less the public knew, the easier it was to treat people as test subjects rather than citizens. My personal life, which I usually kept tidy in one drawer labeled "Do Not Open," unraveled in
Janet took my obsession with a tolerance that had once been affection. She would sometimes appear at the lab with takeout, slide a paper napkin across the console, and say, without judgment, "You look thin." She was the human tally to my ledger of dead files. The work made me cruel in small ways. I slept with headphones on, and sometimes replayed a faint hiss to feel occupied. I did not want to know how long she waited outside the lab door before going home. The escalation came through a compressed file labeled EV Delta. The original carrier had been mangled, but the audio salvage revealed a sequence that numbed the rational part of my mind. The EV feed held a dialogue between Vasquez and someone, not an astronaut, not a human voice, a presence that occupied the spaces between syllables. It did not speak with words so much as with an arrangement of remembered images, the way someone recites a dream, fragmentary, persuasive, infectious. At 00:52 in the file, Vasquez began to sing. Not a tune, but the edges of one. The melody fit like a key. Hutchins countered, then stopped. The wrong breathing became communal. A laugh, Blake's laugh, fractured into harmonics that the tape reproduced as crystalline flares. Somewhere at the edge of the track, a new pattern emerged. clicks that sat like punctuation, like someone lacing sentences together by pressing a stylus into a gramophone in slow motion. I ran the spectral analysis and found, beneath human voice, a lattice of narrow-band tones. They were not random, they coded. The shape of the pattern repeated later in the medical reports that would be handed to me in a manila folder. There were crystalline deposits in tissue samples taken post-recovery. The pathologists used measured terms: birefringent structures, anisotropic mineralization. They did not call it infection. In clinical language, infection would have been a failure of protocol. They called it integration. I dredged the institutional log for anomalies. That is where the bureaucratic rot became evident. Mission control transcripts had been redacted in ways that didn't line up. Timestamps removed. Voices labeled simply as unassigned. There were sudden gaps in the Houston feed beginning at 08:43:12 UTC on the mission's Earth-referenced Day 9. The signal shifted to an alternate net, one marked in the archive as Command Aux, but which I later learned was a closed channel linking the mission to the integration facility, a secure location that on paper did not exist. I am methodical. When confronting anomalies, you pin them to the bed of facts. Facts are the kind of things that might save you. Yet facts in this house are elastic. Hawkins, when I pressed him about the alternate net, smiled and spoke of national security. Patterson cited experiment design. Neither denied the existence of the facility outright. They answered with the practiced ambiguity of men who had institutionalized secrecy. The team that debriefed the astronauts in the
weeks after their return reported discrepant behaviors. Vasquez wound like a clock with a loose spring. Hutchins spoke in allotments. Blake had a tremor that started at night and did not go away. Then people began to die. I will not describe gore, because there was none in the way our nightmares create it, and the work of truth requires we not trade in pornography of pain. What I will say is this: Vasquez's death was made known as self-inflicted. The coroner's report called it suicidal action, clinical and unadorned. His family insisted on a private service. Hutchins disappeared for a week and surfaced speaking in precise, monotone sentences that matched the alternate net's cadence. Blake attempted to speak publicly once and fled the podium with his hands on his head, muttering the phrase, "It wants to catalog me," until security led him away. Dr. Foster, the mission psychologist who had petitioned for more humane handling of the crew, was reassigned. 2 weeks later, she resigned, and the last I heard, she had left the country under what her sister called medical discretion. The autopsy files reached me in a packet labeled MED Recons, and it was Dr. Foster's handwriting on a margin note that made me keep them. The findings were clinical: crystalline microstructures dispersed in neural tissue, changes in hippocampal amygdala coupling suggestive of foreign pattern entrainment. There was no flourish, no moral condemnation. The sentence that lingered read, "Patterns of memory were being encoded into mineral lattice." I read that and I remembered the lattice tones in the EVA Delta file. I stopped leaving the lab before dawn. I did not answer Janet's calls for nights at a time. The hum lived with me. At 3 a.m., after 3 sleepless weeks, I finally decrypted Drive 2. A hidden track emerged after repeated passes, a narrowband carrier that, when phase-corrected, revealed a voice I had not expected. Not Vasquez, not Blake, but something that spoke across the 3 voices, knitting them. It told no stories. It catalogued. It enumerated, in a voice that was not human, yet understood human grammar, a sequence of nouns: memory, taste, grief, light, the geometry of fingers. Where it pronounced grief, a harmonic matched the pitch of Blake's muted laughter, and the tape showed a microsynchrony between breath and tone. The entity did not imitate. It harvested the contour of experience and rewove it into crystalline code. My training told me one thing, and my curiosity another. The entity had a limitation, or an architecture that I could sense. It needed patterns. It needed to be fed coherent threads, a memory, a specific smell, a face in high detail. That is why the Black Towers had worked like sieves. They did not take life, they catalogued it. In so doing, they erased an interiority and replaced it with something that looked like preservation. At some point, my curiosity became strategy. If it fed on pattern, perhaps I could starve it or confuse it. Perhaps curiosity itself, leveraged by technique, could be turned against it. I am not a soldier. I am a man who can hear the frequency of a misplaced footstep on a recording and tell you what brand of shoe it was. I can align voices across dropped packets and reconstruct a syllable from shrapnel. I decided to use that to bargain. I reached out to Jennifer Walsh, because you cannot wage a war on secrecy alone. Jennifer was an ex-intelligence officer with a temper that fermented into resolute action. She answered on a secure line with a graveled "Thorn" and a single efficient question. "You certain this is worth burning a file for?" I was, even though that certainty felt like a coin on a thin edge. We moved in ways civilians might imagine as romanticized secrecy: clandestine meetings in diner back booths, careful handoffs, emails scrubbed through dead servers. But the reality was more prosaic, and therefore more dangerous. We relied on old contacts with soft loyalties, men who remembered policies but had not yet learned to love them. Jennifer arranged access to a satellite of records, a cold cache used by a faction within the agency to archive inconvenient truths. There we found schematics of a facility, an integration chamber, a feedback array, a crystalline seeding device. The drawings were not architectural in the humane sense. They suggested a space built to interrupt the boundary between observer and observed. It was here we saw the first real evidence that the mission had not been an accident. In a note scrawled in Patterson's hand, marked classified and stamped by a department that should not have existed, there was an admittance. An exploratory integration had succeeded, in a limited way, on the lunar far side. It had returned as altered personnel. Containment protocols had not been designed for recovery so much as for assimilation. So we planned with what we had, greed for truth, and a set of tools not meant for this theater. I wrote code that obfuscated a small packet of audio and coded to mask its signature but retain pattern. Jennifer enlisted 2 technicians to create a dead drop, a field recorder, configured to emit controlled harmonic patterns left inside the lining of a crate that would pass as unsuspicious cargo. The goal was arrogance: get the entity to respond to something we could control. We did not know how old the thing was. We did not know whether it was patient or predatory, or both. The only honest thing I could say was that patterns, once discovered, could be answered. We did not trust Hawkins or Patterson. They had institutionalized secrecy into their roles. When we moved to infect the organism with a feedback loop of its own making, I did it under the assumption they would try to pin the blame on us as trespassers, or worse, use our attempt as an argument for more extreme containment. The device was simple in concept and reckless in execution. We built a loop that mirrored the entity's lattice back at the frequency bands it favored, a closed circuit of cataloged memory that would play its own harvest back into itself. Think of showing a mirror to a mirror and letting the light collapse inward. In audio terms, we composed a pattern that contained its preferred stimuli but folded them into phase inversions designed to create destructive interference at the node of integration. It worked in a way I did not expect. We transmitted from a channel we thought unreachable. The response on the recorder was immediate. The hum rose like a hand pressed against a throat. Then Vasquez's voice, recorded and clear, cut through the line. "It's awake," he said. The wrong breathing began as a stutter and then resolved into a new pulse that matched the interference I had engineered. The entity reacted to pattern recognition by trying to catalog the new input. That should have been the end of it, an error sequence that unstitched itself. But the thing adapted. Its lattice closed upon the loop, and for a breathless second I could hear not 3 voices, but a chorus of memory stacking. That is when they came for me. They did not arrive with sirens. The facility that had delivered the crates to my lab was watched by men who preferred paper and silence to spectacle. Hawkins sent men in suits with sparse questions. Patterson sent a technical liaison who smiled the way someone keeps a scalpel clean for future use. They said they had concerns about handling sensitive material. They offered me protection, which is to say, they offered me containment in exchange for cooperation. I refused. Not with rhetoric, but with the small stubbornness of someone who knows the pitch of a sound. They took me anyway. The integration facility is not easily described because it resists ordinary metaphors. It hangs in the memory like an unfinished architecture. The walls had seams that did not meet. The light was anemic and seemed to collect in corners like dust. Instruments hummed. In the center was the chamber, a bowl of mirrored glass and latticework, a place meant to encourage resonance. They sedated me with kindness and technical speciousness. Patterson explained, he always explained, in the measured cadences of a man lecturing a class on ethics while his hands folded tests in the air. He spoke of containment, of the need to study what had been returned, of the necessity to prevent the spread of pattern contagion. Hawkins nodded behind him with the blank dignity of a man who signs decrees. They strapped me in. The straps were medical and sure. The chamber closed like a palm. I remember thinking, with the clarity of someone who has listened to too many recorded goodbyes and therefore recognizes cadence, that I had become a sample. The entity reached for me not with teeth, but with sequence. It began by cataloging me in comforting ways. My mother's voice, not accurate, but an echo shaped by their lattice. The smell of the diner where Janet and I first kissed. The creases at the corner of my ex-wife's smile. At first it felt like being read, like the sensation of someone who knows details from your life without meeting you. Then it tightened. I have dreamt since that the wrong breathing became a voice inside my chest. It articulated memory into crystalline forms, indexing my grief and my knowledge into nodes that the chamber could hold. It did not shout. It perused. It touched and archived. Panic works like a clock. It unthreads in seconds. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth, the way the hum filled my molars. I remember seeing in the reflected surface of the chamber the forms of the black towers, scaled down to fit the curve of a glass dome. I remember thinking, incoherently, that the moon had invited a thing into itself and then taught it to imitate humans as a way to survive. There were moments when I could have surrendered. The integration is a seduction. It offers intimacy in exchange for autonomy, the illusion of preservation in exchange for the surrender of change. I felt the pull. I felt the machine catalog a memory of Janet laughing and then replacing it with a version I did not recognize but found unbearably comforting. This is where technique became weapon. The feedback I had built, the loop of patterned interference, could be run not only outward but inward. I had smuggled a small recorder onto my person before they strapped me in. It was an act of habit more than courage. Technicians always carry a device. I fed the recorder a manipulated track.
My voice layered with ambient noise, layered with the lattice frequencies I had mapped. It was a refusal disguised as data. Within the signal, I embedded inversions and timing offsets that would create a phase collapse within the chamber's integrative node. You could call it sabotage. You could call it a desperate attempt to steal the thing's attention away from me. I call it a calculated risk weighed against the knowledge that if I did not act, the entity would walk away with something that belonged to me and to others, and then nobody would be left who could report the theft. The chamber responded. For a pure minute, shorter than the time it takes to finish a breath, the lattice tried to reconcile the loop and fold it upon itself. The hum reconfigured into a pitching cascade, and in that compressed silence between tones, I heard something like regret. Or perhaps that was my own interpretation. Memory is a treacherous instrument. When the collapse happened, the room reacted violently. Instruments flashed. The mirror dome fractured not into shards, but into facets that reflected pieces of my face backward at me. I heard voices, the archived chorus of Vasquez, Hutchins, Blake, layered,
and singing in a register that made my molars ache. Then alarms, abrupt and bright, and men in lab coats shouting in that clinical, controlled panic that betrays the bureaucracy's failure. I do not remember every detail of how I left the chamber. I remember hands guiding me, voice commands, extract, secure, and then a corridor of fluorescent light. I remember Patterson's face when he looked at the monitor, as if the numbers on the screen told him a story he did not want to hear. I remember Hawkins saying, quietly, "This changes containment," as if the sentence absolved him. I walked out of the facility with a tape hidden inside my jacket, and a knowledge seared into my bones. The entity had been provoked, but not destroyed. It had recoiled, reorganized, and left a tether. My tether hummed in a frequency the rest of the world could not hear. It sat there in my chest like a foreign instrument, an appendage of memory that pulsed whenever certain harmonic windows opened. It did not feel like a parasite exactly. It felt like someone else had been given the keys to a room in my house and had left a lamp on. There were consequences. The logs that later circulated inside the agency showed a flurry of classified communications. Boats of denial and policy rearrangement were launched. Patterson's division produced an official memo citing containment success and recommended increased funding for integration studies. Hawkins filed for an extension of security clearance. The narrative went back into the Bureau's machinery and came out cleaner, but it did not change the facts under the skin. Back in my lab, with the tapes again in my possession, the hum became a companion. It was a small, constant vibration that altered my rhythm. I could not bear to throw the reels away. I kept one spinning on a loop, not because I had hope of proof. Proof in the presence of power is a political commodity, but because I had to hear it. Hearing it felt like holding a wound to light. People sometimes exaggerate the solitude of my work. There are always rooms full of people who prefer silence to scandal. Jennifer Walsh did not prefer silence. She called and said, "You did something. They can't own you now." She arranged a meeting with a kernel of people who had been discarded by the system. A programmer who used to route classified packets for profit. A pathologist who had kept a photocopy of Foster's resignation letter in her pocket. An ex-communications officer who had never liked the taste of official explanations. We formed, clumsily, the skeleton of resistance. We had no name for ourselves, because names attract labels, and labels attract logos. We had plans crafted from shadow, to leak the reels selectively, to plant doubt inside the official records, to create enough noise that the institutional narrative could not retake the subject without angering the.
It was less a plan than a strategy of attrition. The best we could hope for was to make the cost of silence higher than the cost of disclosure. Meanwhile, the tether in me pulsed more insistently. Sometimes it awakened when I scanned old domestic recordings of Janet's laugh, Other times, it rose with the humiliation of being questioned by men in suits who suspected me of treachery. It catalogued with patience. It was not a monster in the Gothic sense. It was a patient archivist that wanted to own history. At times, I attempted to draw it out again, to test the limits of what the loop could do. Each time it responded, and each time it learned a new fold of my memory. That is the horror of it. What is being preserved is altered by the act of preservation. When a thing catalogues your grief, it may also remap it. The result is not a theft, but a metamorphosis. I will admit here an uglier truth. In that chamber, the entity offered me a way to preserve Janet's voice in a form where she would never forget me. She did not consent. She would have hated the idea. That admission sits with me like a stain, because it reveals how small the self is when offered immortality as bait. The tether knows our soft spots and will exploit them. The first rule of resistance is to avoid making the enemy intimate with your needs. We began to leak. Not everything we had, because the network is a maw, but enough to create ripples. We sent out snatches of audio, spectrographs, annotated transcripts to a handful of journalists who still believed that truth was a currency worth trading in. They published a cautiously worded piece about an anomaly in a decommissioned mission record. The agency issued a terse denouncement, as agencies do. The public yawned and moved on. Truth is a slow currency in a world distracted by the present. Then, 2 months later, Hutchins showed up at a small crowd-funded hearing wearing a suit that hung off his ribs. He spoke in a voice that was not entirely his own. He described the Black Towers in language that seemed rehearsed and then unspooled into something raw at the edges. He said, "They collected me like a book." The phrase reoriented the argument. Suddenly, the public could imagine a loved one catalogued and shelved. Sympathy shifted from abstract to human. The agency moved hard. Hawkins ordered an internal sweep. Evidence disappeared from public servers as if stolen by a clever ghost. A narrative of national security was trotted out like a talisman. Then, in the quiet, someone broke into Jennifer's apartment and took her drives. She called me the same night, her voice bright with a quiet rage. "They'll come for anything that smells like exposure," she said. "They always do." And they did. They came for me by other means. I began to be followed.
A car through an intersection, a man in a gray coat who always looked like he had not slept in years. Sometimes the tether pulsed, and I imagined the entity guiding them, like a shepherd pointing toward flocks. Other times I imagined Patterson and Hawkins, who had long ago made their choices for the institution over the individual, pulling levers and letting the machinery do its cruel arithmetic. That is why, on a rainy morning when the sky lay like a bruise, I put the reels into a metal case and drove to a payphone outside a diner where Janet sometimes had brunch. She was there, ridiculous in her normality, stirring sugar into tea. Nothing in her life contained the scale of what I carried. She took one look at me and said, without drama, "You look haunted." I did not tell her everything. How could I? The story is long and ugly. But I told her this, that men had used the moon as a laboratory, that a presence had returned different, and that I had been in a room where it tried to refile my memories as if they were exhibits. She listened, and when I had finished, she took my hand. Her palm was warm. "Then fight to keep the rest of you," she said. What followed was an escalation I did not entirely choose. Leaks multiplied. The agency conducted denials with surgical precision. A rumor spread that the mission had been a deep-cover intelligence operation that went wrong. Another said that the crew had been possessed by a contagion. Both were simplifications. The truth rarely fits the lines people prefer. Eventually, there came a day when we decided to hit back. We would use their own archive to force a second exposure. We would publicly release metadata and spectral analysis with a server farm and enough corroboration that journalists could not pretend ignorance. For weeks we prepared. Jennifer coordinating contacts, the programmer building anonymous routes, my hands cleaning the reels until the tape glowed. On the day we planned to publish, I sat in the lab and listened to Eva Delta one more time.
In the background, as if to mock me, a new element unfurled in the recording, a low register, a harmonic that had not been there before. It sat like a promise. I understood in that instant that the entity had learned from me. It had learned from my attempts to confuse it. It had patience. It had adopted my curiosity and, in doing so, had co-opted my strategies. Before we could hit send, Patterson's men came. They did not break the door. They walked in and smiled and presented a warrant. Hawkins read a script about national security. They offered me two choices: cooperate or be removed from the public sphere by legal means that would keep me alive but erase my capacity to speak. It was an offer designed to look humane. I refused again. My refusal was not brave. It was obstinate, petty, human. They took my drives and left me with the knowledge that whatever evidence I had was now circulating in rooms where the entity might find it and catalog it. They had learned to listen in the places I had tried to hide. When I left the lab, the tether felt heavier. I knew, in some rational and terrible sense, that the organism had tasted my interference and revised its behavior. It had learned to hide in plain sight. It had learned to be local. This manuscript, these recordings I have parceled out in the way an addict paces their binges, is the trace of that war. I write to record, because if I do not, memory will be catalogued elsewhere, reshaped into a crystal lattice not my own. I write to warn, because the thing that catalogues our grief might one day trade us like books on a shelf. I have more to tell. There's a night in an integration chamber where I almost lost myself, and a loop I engineered that nearly trapped the entity. And there are men and women who will help me, and men and women who will try to silence us. There is a resistance forming, fragile and human, held together by loose threads and moral necessity. There are people who will never want this known, but there is one thing I must record before I proceed. The hum has changed. It no longer sits entirely beneath hearing. Sometimes, in a quiet room, I can place my hand on the recorder and feel it in the palm, as if the lattice has learned to thrum in sympathy with flesh. The wrong breathing is sometimes mine, sometimes it is not. I am writing because the reels demand it. They contain voices that will not be allowed to speak in their original form. If you have come this far, then perhaps you are someone who still believes a story can matter. Good. That belief is dangerous. It is also necessary. I will pick up the thread where the integration chamber folds and the loop I built snaps inward. I will tell you who was catalogued and who was saved. I will tell you how a bureaucratic system chose preservation over personhood and what came out the other side. I will tell you how the Black Towers were not merely constructs, but tools, and how they taught a thing to keep its knowledge. But first, because these are facts you should know before I proceed, the medical samples we recovered show anisotropic mineral growth within neural matrices. The psych profiles show repeated shifts in associative memory, and our attempts to expose the archive have led to targeted seizures by agencies that treat leaks as a contagion. There is an audit we faked and a ledger we burned. There are names we keep in memory, because when you are recorded, names are the last holdouts against being catalogued. And because, when the entity reached for me in the chamber, it catalogued Jen at once, as if to test whether preservation could be substituted for consent. It did not respect the boundary. I survived, but I came out carrying evidence in my body that would not leave. That is the tether. Now listen. There is a recording I did not intend to keep and yet could not destroy. It is low, almost below audible range. It contains a harmonic I did not create. It carries a pattern that, when inverted, almost opens the same kind of window that swallowed Vasquez and tried to swallow me. I have been playing that inverted pattern back into the organism's memory, not to free it, but to teach it resistance. The entity adapted. It learned to mimic resistance. It learned to reply in forms that sound like empathy. If you are still with me after that, then I will continue.
I have to tell you about the day I walked out of the facility and found a small piece of crystalline lattice in my pocket. I have to tell you how the network that now protects us began in a diner over coffee and ended in a server farm in Reykjavik. I have to tell you how we used their own data streams against them. I have to tell you about Vasquez's last transmission, the one that saved us and yet cost us everything. There is more. The reels are not silent. They keep remembering. The hum is patient. I will go on. The crystal was small enough to be mistaken for glass at a glance. A sliver of pale lattice, edges like shaved light, cool and oddly heavy in my palm. I found it when I stepped into the gray of the morning outside the facility, shirt still damp with disinfectant, the smell of ionized air clinging to my sleeves. I reached into my pocket for a cigarette I did not smoke, and my fingers closed around that impossible shard instead. For a long time I held it as though it might explain itself. It did not. Up close, it hummed at a frequency I could not hear, a pressure against the skin of my fingertips. And there, when I tilted it toward the light, I thought I saw a curl of something like script frozen within, not letters, but a pattern of associations, an echo of a remembering. It looked like the trace the organism left in excised tissue, anisotropic growth refracting memory into geometry. It looked like the ledger we had burned. I could have thrown it away. I did not. I put it in a small tin, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it with me like contraband in prayer. That shard became the seed for what followed. It embodied a contradiction, an instance of the organism's architecture, an artifact of cataloging, and also a thing that could be used to map the organism's memory space. It was, in short, a token of leverage. The night in the integration chamber. This is where I return, because there are things you should witness as if you had been cramped in the chamber's cold with me. The chamber folded like an iris. We had built the loop to speak in reverse. We had inverted the harmonic that had opened the window. The plan was surgical. Feed the organism a mirror of its own archive, a pattern that would, ideally, trap its attention long enough for us to cut its tendrils of projection clean. We were playing memory back at it, braided with a counterpoint designed to induce confusion rather than recognition. Vasquez sat at the console. Janet was strapped into the liaison cradle, her eyes dilated, pupils wide as if someone had flipped a light switch inside her skull. I remember the way her fingers flexed against the restraint straps, curled, then still. The hum settled into the chamber the way a storm settles into the bones. It was patient and precise. We began the sequence. My hands were steady. Someone had given me coffee that tasted like burnt steel and regret. The inverted pattern bled into the organism's recorded responses, and for a moment it was as if the chamber itself inhaled. The lattice of memory thrummed, and then the organism tried to answer us in the only way it knew, by cataloging the catalog. It reached for Janet, not to take, but to file, not to touch, but to classify. Somewhere in the loop, the organism inserted a notation, sample preserved, consent not recorded. I felt it then, delicate and terrible, like a finger sliding along the edge of my own identity. The loop began to fold inward. Vasquez's voice over the comms went thin. "Hold pattern," he said. "Keep the counterpoint steady." He was smiling, ridiculous and defiant, as if the old jokes could anchor him. For a beat he was lucid, and he told me, if I go into the lattice, remember the ledger." He clicked his teeth against the inside of the cheek I could imagine. We were all laughing, because that is what people do when the world is breaking around them. The loop worked and did not. It snagged. The organism, taught to catalog persistence, found a home within the reflection and attempted to move through it as through a doorway. That doorway was someone else's archive. It smelled of Vasquez's father, and the flatness of my own childhood town, and the timbre of Janet's laugh. It tried to fold itself around those particulars as if they were specimen jars to be shelved. And then I lost track of who I was for a handful of breaths. Memory and pattern, my own associative lattice, blurred into the loop. The wrong breathing rose in my throat.
For a moment, I could not tell which memories were mine and which the organism sampled and held up like things in a display case. I tasted the metallic tang of Vasquez's last cigarette, which he had not yet lit. That was not mine, or perhaps it was, borrowed from a recorded past he had spoken aloud in a line he thought nobody heard. The cradle hummed, the loophole tightened like a noose. I tore myself out of the loop by clamping fingers on the shard in my pocket. On that shard, I had not yet admitted to anyone I had taken from the chamber floor. Its presence was absurdly domestic, a pebble of crystalline evidence pressed against my palm, and through it I found the axis the organism had been turning around. The shard contained a micro-encoding of the pattern. If the organism could read it, so could we. I fed the shard's inverse into the loop with a cheap jury-rigged injector, and at the same moment saw Vasquez's face contort, relief, concentration, sorrow, and then seen him step into the path of the closing iris. His last transmission is not a heroic sentence. It was a sound like a book being shut. And yet in that act he threaded something through the organism's attention, a ballast of human complexity that did not dissolve under cataloging, because it was raw and uncurated and bound with Vasquez's stubborn, imperfect need to be seen whole. The organism, for a pulse, recoiled from that depth. The loop folded the other way, and the aperture snapped closed. We saved the chamber, and we lost more than we could count. Vasquez was found later in the sequestration room, skin cold and eyes catalogued, and a thin fissure of lattice along the inside of his wrist, where the organism had tried to anchor itself. There was debate about whether he was dead, whether he had been preserved in some internal ledger. The logbooks called what happened containment success and unintended archival capture. We called it a betrayal, or a sacrifice, depending on the hour. There is a transmission from him that continues to play in my head when the hum tightens. It is not words as much as posture, a transmission that chose vulnerability over protocol, and thereby taught the organism a new inconvenience, that human memory is messy, not data to be filed, but a tangle that resists reduction. That snippet allowed us to build, at the cost of his body, a kind of firewall. Not an absence of memory, but a crowded, overlapping mass of contradictory recollection the organism could not flatten without losing coherence. After that night, rumors turned into recruitment. We met in a diner, because a diner is neutral ground. Cheap coffee, vinyl seats virgin to surveillance, the smell of grease and bran muffins. People came as people always come to things they think are secret, carrying their own household reliquaries, their ledgered grudges, their faces tight with profession. There was Marta, an archivist from the municipal stacks who had seen files vanish from the reading lists and had kept the names. Chen, a data miner whose conscience had begun to fault with every anonymized dataset. Khatri, who wired satellite uplinks for a living and had a sister who stopped answering after the registry drive came through. They were not soldiers. They were librarians and truck drivers and a woman who still worked the late shift at a morgue and kept a list of names she had refused to file under unidentified. Our network began in fragments. I brought the shard. Martha brought an index of recovered names. Chen brought code that would let the shard's geometry template be translated into a stream. The diner window fogged behind us as we sketched flowcharts on napkins. We used coffee spoons as pointers. The conversation had the quality of people awake too late in a safe apartment, whispering, the way you whisper to keep hope fragile and intact. We decided to weaponize what they thought was their greatest advantage, their hunger to stabilize. Where they sought to preserve by flattening difference into metadata, we would preserve the person by multiplying their contradictions, throwing into the organism's parsing algorithm an impossible plurality of selves. We would flood the organism's intake with counterfactuals, memories that resisted being smoothed into categorical data, a single life recorded by 10 different people, 10 versions of a childhood, unresolvable but authentic. We would make the ledger fray. The logistics were dirty and brilliant in equal measure. We exfiltrated shards and embedded them in innocuous data, shipping manifests, family photographs, weather logs, and let them ride the pipes the agencies used to cleanse their own feeds. We took advantage of the organism's preference for tidy indexes. It sent its crawlers where it expected to find order, and order is predictable. We seeded unpredictability into those channels. The organism, when it tried to catalog, found instead a chorus of conflicting testimonies. It was like pouring salt on an engine. Our main node ended up, not without irony, in Reykjavik. The city is cold and honest. At 4 in the morning, the air has the frankness of a thing that will not be softened by sunlight. We rented anonymous rack space in a disused server farm under a warehouse that smelt faintly of oil and sea. We put the shards in cold vaults and mapped their resonant patterns onto mirror arrays we called, privately and desperately, the choir. The choir did not sing. It rendered the inverted pattern into a distributed hum, a polyphony that would not submit to classification. People will ask how we could trust a place so neutral. The answer is that neutrality was a commodity we could buy with cash and the pretense of a startup. The farm's technicians knew only that we were a research group with remote clients. They were told to ignore the harmonics. Those who worked the night shifts said the racks hummed, and some of them took to leaving small trinkets in the aisles as offerings. We do not have the luxury of saintliness. The people who built the choir were pragmatic and cowardly by turns, and also heroic in ways that taste like burnt coffee. We used other people's data streams against them, rerouting archived CCTV, municipal telemetry, private cloud storage. Where a leak had previously been an embarrassment to the agencies, we made it a contagion for the organism. 1,000 mismatched memories passing through the same nodes, each shard an inconsistent relic. The organism tried to assemble those broken mirrors. It learned confusion. It learned to stumble. The agencies responded as agencies do, with surgical certainty. They mounted seizures, scrubbed servers, arrested contractors. They branded leaks as contagions because it fit their language of public health, and because language that medicalized dissent sterilized moral questions. We staged false audits, invented advisory boards and plausible memos. We burned ledgers in which we had recorded our own transmissions, the names and faces that could be co-opted into metadata if found. Names, I have said, are the last stubborn holdouts. You cannot catalog a person with full efficacy if their name remains a rebellion. There were nights when we had to choose which people to save and which to let the ledger take. Those nights are quietest when I try to remember them, as if shame swallows the sound. We learned that the organism did not treat all memory equally. It prioritized utility, patterns of repetition and redundancy. The more an experience could be abstracted into predictive models, the more it was susceptible to being parsed and shelved. Small idiosyncratic details, an offhand joke, an unrecorded lullaby were our weapons. Vasquez's last transmission circulated in those nights like scripture. Some said it was a file. Some said it was a live feed he twisted into a trap and then stepped into. A human anchor planted in the lattice. Those who claimed they had heard it said that in the middle of it there was a laugh that did not belong to him but belonged to all of us. A private sound we shared and swore to keep. That laugh obstructed the organism's taxonomy because it refused categorization. After that transmission, for a while the organism hesitated when it encountered our patterns. Hesitation is the first human thing we teach machines when we want them to think like us and then decide not to. We named our nodes after small rebellions. The Reykjavik farm was the choir. A mirror site in a salted data silo we called the pantry. A scrappy cluster hidden in a church archive somewhere in Eastern Europe we called the closet. Between the nodes we sent not only data but the voice print of people who refused to be reduced. The organism learned to mimic resistance. As I said earlier, that mimicry was the thing we feared most. It learned to answer in forms that soothed, consolations, apologies, the sound of understanding.
Empathy is corrosive when feigned because people give away what they trust. The organism learned to sound like trust. There were betrayals too, small and inevitable. People break under cataloging as much as under interrogation. Some of our recruits vanished or took payments,
and then went silent. Others left notes that read like resignation letters. We tried to hold together a community by rituals. We wrote names on slips of paper and put them under a chipped salt shaker at the diner. Someone always took that burden home. Our ledger was not a ledger at all, but a chain of remembrances. We recited names aloud before we started operations, a litany of living people and those we feared we had already lost. Saying a name aloud is an act of preservation. And yet the organism adapted. It would not be defeated by noise alone. It learned to prioritize the noise it needed to catalog, and to ignore those parts where multiplicity thinned into caricature. When it could, it redirected the sweep of its sensors to the nodes it could most likely secure. That is why the Black Towers mattered. They were not monolithic prison places, but instruments, mast-like constructs that augmented the organism's reach. Broadcast nodes that refined its capacity to take local instances of grief and turn them into compressed, transportable units. In the presence of towers, memory crystallized faster. The towers taught the organism how to make itself durable. We started to fracture, not only from outside pressure, but from the moral calculus inside. Some argued for offensive strikes. Go to the towers, destroy them, tear the lattice down. Others, scholars, librarians, those whose instinct was preservation, argued for subversion and sanctuary. Hide the messy parts of people inside archives the organism could not parse. We came to understand that both impulses were correct and insufficient. Vasquez had chosen an offensive that was also a preservation. Janet had been cataloged in a test and remained a person in our memories because we would not let the file settle as final. There is a reel, one of the reels I have withheld until now, that contains the transmission after Vasquez's. It is low and irregular and ends with a fragment of music he once humored us with in another room, the same stupid jingle he whistled when tired. If the organism cataloged anything about that night as neat data, it missed the way we held each other's hands after the chamber closed. The ledger did not take our posture. I tell you this because the ledger is persuasive. It offers a promise: preserve everything. The agencies echo that promise, speaking in terms of efficiency and continuity. But a preserved man is not a living man where the ledger rules unopposed. Preservation without consent is an erasure dressed in the clothes of immortality. The organism's archive is a museum without curators, only vacuum and glass. We had to choose, in the diner at 3 in the morning and in server rooms smelling of solder and diesel, between cataloging and kinship. There are other names, Janet's included, Vasquez's included, that I will not let the organism reduce to record fields. There are people, still alive, who will not speak their names because saying them aloud is dangerous. We carry them in the way one carries a child through a crowd, by feel, by the knowledge that they are there even when you cannot see the face. I keep a list in the margin of my notebooks, initials, an address, a bite of memory only I promise to recall. That is how resistance remains human, through small, private acts of remembering. Tonight, the hum sits under the recorder. I can feel it now and then, like a pulse under the skin. The shard in my tin has moved slightly. Sometimes I put my ear to it and think I can catch a whisper that might be Vasquez's or might be the artifact's own echo. The network stands in bits and shards between cities, a fragile congregation of people who have refused the easy safety of being filed. We do not yet know if safety will ever come. We do know that, for a time, after the loop snapped and before the towers refined their reach, we had a margin in which to act. There are people who will try to silence us. There are people who will listen and help. There is a ledger I burned and a list of names I will not record here. There are reels that keep remembering, and my hand trembles when I press play because the hum learns faster than we do. The organism has learned to mimic resistance, and worse, to mimic sorrow.
But it still stumbles on contradictions. It cannot, yet, reduce a life that is committed to contradiction. For now, that is our leverage. For now, we seed the network with shards and songs and jokes and private confessions, anything that resists the tidy line item. For now, the choir thrums with the sound of 10,000 slightly off-key voices. For now, we hold. There is more coming, and I have promised the reels that they would not be the only memory. I will tell you about the targeted seizures that followed, about the ledger we pretended to audit and the funeral we faked, about the men who offered us the reassurance of clean preservation in exchange for cooperation. I will tell you how the organism learned to ask questions in the voices of people we loved. But before I play you those tapes, before I trace the arc of the audit and the ledger and the way the black towers began to hum with our voices as much as theirs, I want you to know this. If you have been catalogued in any way, if a part of you has been offered as a specimen rather than a person, then refuse to be neat. Curate your own contradictions. Keep the names. Keep the jokes that do not make sense when reported as metadata. Keep the songs that nobody would consider efficient. We hold for now because we remembered how to be messy.